I believe Disney has divided Star Wars fandom more than anything else. The sequel trilogy was a big contributing factor to that division. The way that they mishandled the original Star Wars cast and pushed them all aside in favor of these new trilogy heroes. Add in some of the recent disappointments of Kenobi and Boba Fett and Mandalorian Season 3, and it's no wonder that Star Wars fans are upset, and I think they have right to be. Now, regardless of where you stand about the new trilogy versus the old trilogy versus the prequels, none of that matters to me because we can all be friends as long as we all love Star Wars. And that brings us to the topic today. What if George Lucas had never sold to Disney? Let's travel back in time to 2012. It's October 17th, and Lance Armstrong has just lost a number of endorsements over his Tour de France doping scandal. October 23rd, Skyfall, the 23rd James Bond film directed by Sam Mendes and starring Daniel Craig and Javier Bardem, premieres in London. And October 29th, Hurricane Sandy makes landfall in New Jersey, resulting in 110 deaths and $50 billion in damage, and forces the New York Stock Exchange to close. And October 30th, 2012, George Lucas wakes up and decides that he does in fact want to keep Star Wars. And in fact, he wants to make the sequel trilogy that he had been working on for quite some time. So he goes downstairs, he picks up the phone, he calls Bob Iger over at Disney and simply says these two words:
"No way, no way."
What happens next? We're going to look at 4 main areas that I believe need our consideration of what would be different if George Lucas had never sold to Disney. That's going to be looking at the movies, the TV shows in the EU, talking about video games, and last but not least, talking about the fandom itself. It was a well-known fact that George's primary reason for selling Disney is that he didn't think he had it in him to do another trilogy, that he had grown tired and wanted to have a family. He also shared how difficult it was with Empire Strikes Back and Return of the Jedi to be on the set every day, even though he wasn't the one directing those movies. It would be a lot of the same with this new trilogy, but George has decided he's all in. So what does he do? George would bring the Skywalker saga to a conclusion. This isn't a reboot. It's not trying to get people to buy into new characters and sell new toys. He wasn't concerned about the box office numbers and the future marketability of Star Wars as much as he was about telling the story. The poetry of it all was far more important than all that other stuff. George is quoted as saying episodes 7, 8, and 9 would take ideas from what happened after the Iraq War. Okay, you fought the war, you killed everybody, now what are you going to do? Rebuilding afterwards is harder than starting a rebellion or fighting the war. This power vacuum is taken advantage of by the crime syndicates as a result of Darth Maul basically becoming the godfather of the universe.
You don't ask with respect. You don't offer friendship. You don't even think to call me godfather.
Darth Maul also had an apprentice, Darth Talon, who would be the successor of sorts once Maul was gone. She was ruthless and basically becomes the new Darth Vader, the one who would be the muscle and do the dirty work needed to rule the syndicates. George continues. He says, the main story, it starts out a few years after the Return of the Jedi, and we establish pretty quickly that there's this underworld. There are these offshoot stormtroopers who started their own planets, and that Luke is trying to restart the Jedi. He puts the word out, so out of 100,000 Jedi, maybe 50 or 100 are left. Now these are survivors from Order 66. The Jedi have to grow again from scratch, so Luke has to find 2- and 3-year-olds to train them. It'll be 20 years before you have a new generation of Jedi. And by the end of the trilogy, Luke would have rebuilt much of the Jedi, and we would have the renewal of the New Republic with Leia, Senator Organa becoming the Supreme Chancellor in charge of everything, so she ended up being the chosen one. George would also use these films to flesh out the understanding of midichlorians and the wills much further, both things that have been controversial with fans, and one of the main criticisms coming from the prequels. Now, I don't necessarily know that I would love a trilogy going into the Star Wars science. All I do know is I'd be interested to at least see what George would do. Seeing Luke rebuild the Jedi and Leia bring stability to the galaxy, really bringing to a close these storylines and characters which we have come to love and enjoy throughout the years and have been a big part of many of our childhoods. And all the while, this would happen while trying to squash the remaining sects of stormtroopers and these syndicates that are grabbing power. It sounds like a thought-out plan with an end in mind, which is far more than can be said for the sequel trilogy that we got, because there was no plan. I cannot imagine you starting a movie and a trilogy without having the end in mind. So where would these movies land? What would be the outcome? What would be the end result? Would it be any different? We do know from what George has said that Luke would still be dead, but this would be the death of a hero, not some old, cynical, washed-up Jedi who gave up on everything. Instead, this would be the ending to Luke's story that we all wanted. But after all, this is what Disney does again and again. Leia would be working even harder to bring peace throughout the galaxy, kind of finishing what her mother Padme had started and bringing a beautiful close and a beautiful peace to the galaxy, because that's ultimately what the Emperor was saying he was trying to do, but really it's Leia that's able to bring peace to the galaxy. George's story ends where it was meant to, not with a reboot. Now, there are some concerns that I think are fair. Some of the ways that CGI had been used in the prequels as opposed to the practical sets, and we're even seeing that in some of the shows, does concern me a little bit. But I think George would learn some from the things he did in the prequels, and new technology in the 2010s, I think would have brought about a beautiful balance between both, where it wouldn't have necessarily just been everything green screen, throw out all the models, throw out all the practical sets, because we've seen the difference that the practical sets make in shows like Andor versus shows like Kenobi. That's what I think about the movies. What am I missing? Let me know down below. Now let's talk about TV shows and the expanded universe. Honestly, I think the main focus would still be the movies, the trilogy, to close out the Skywalker saga. And so all the TV shows and everything else would take a backseat to that. We've seen that flipped in the Disneyverse, where it's all about the TV shows because they really want to push their streaming service and get people to subscribe and pay monthly, as opposed to just go to a movie once or twice. Now, it was reported that George had already written 40 to 50 episodes of a show called Underworld. However, because of the financial challenges to even consider making a show of the quality he was considering, it was just absolutely ridiculous to think about. Whereas today we see budgets that are in the $250 million range, which would make this show possible. Now, I think that this would mean that Star Wars would have to partner up with an already existent streaming service, because I don't think they were going to be in the business of figuring out launching their own streaming. That again would take away from the movies. So maybe they partner with someone like HBO. I don't see them going with someone like Netflix or something like that, but more of a maybe established place like HBO. So let's pretend that the show Underworld airs on HBO.
Raven's droid reports rebel activity in the area.
But what about all of those other things that we got? Well, we probably wouldn't get Mandalorian. We probably wouldn't get Boba Fett. We probably wouldn't get some of the TV shows we've gotten as of late that Disney produced. Why? Because George had already written these episodes. Now, I do believe the Clone Wars animated show would have continued, and we probably would have seen maybe a lot more seasons of that, as they would have produced something for younger audiences, and then this Underworld would come in for a little bit older audiences. Star Wars Underworld is actually maybe a lot like what we got with Andor, but set in a different place. It's kind of like episode 4. It's funny, there's action, but it's a lot more talky. It's more of what I would call a soap opera with a bunch of personal dramas in it. It's not really based on an action adventure films from the 30s. It's actually more based on film noir movies from the 40s. So Star Wars Underworld is said to be set primarily in the Coruscant Underworld, which is briefly glimpsed during Star Wars Episode 2, Attack of the Clones, in the time period between Star Wars Episode 3, Revenge of the Sith, and Star Wars Episode 4, A New Hope. So between Revenge of the Sith and A New Hope. It is during this period that the Galactic Empire rises to ultimate power throughout the galaxy, and in 2005, George Lucas told Celebration 3 audiences that the show would not focus on any characters from the films, but that some of them could appear. A lot of issues from the films are connected, but you won't necessarily see a lot of the people that are connected. He later described the show as a bare bones and action heavy, and explained that it would depict what inhabitants of the Star Wars galaxy do for entertainment. What do you think? Is that a show that you would have been interested in? What about the expanded universe? With Disney, we've seen the expanded universe kind of be shoved to the side and forgotten about, and I believe George Lucas would have taken the same tack that he always had about the expanded universe, where he kind of let those things happen. He let people use the Star Wars IP to write novels and comics and all these other things that just happened in the Star Wars universe.
I haven't read any of the novels. I don't know anything about that world. That world's a different world than my world, but I do try to keep it consistent. The way I do it now is they have a Star Wars encyclopedia. So if I come up with a name or something else, I look it up and see if it's already been used. When I said other people could make their own Star Wars stories, we decided that, like Star Trek, we would have two universes. My universe and then this other one. They try to make their universe as consistent with mine as possible, but obviously they get enthusiastic and want to go off in other directions.
So I think we actually would have had a lot more, because if you look at much of what has been produced in the Disney era, it's just all relating back to the films. And a lot of people don't want to read or be more involved with the characters that they made in those films, because they just didn't enjoy what was planned out, because there wasn't really a good plan. But I do think with the TV shows, we would have gotten more in the Clone Wars era. So it means more with Obi-Wan, Ahsoka, and Anakin. I think we would have seen more in that vein and in that light, and some of those characters might have come to this Underworld live action series as well. Just imagine all the cool and interesting things, how many more things we could have gotten over these past 11 years with the expanded universe novels, graphic novels, comic books, all of those type of things. Let's talk video games. Video games are an essential part of Star Wars fandom, and for many of us who grew up playing these games, this is how we interacted most with Star Wars. From the 1980s to the 2010s, 84 video games were produced with the Star Wars IP. Now, I'm not suggesting that all 84 of those video games were fantastic. There's some that weren't, but overall, we got a lot to choose from, and we got some pretty awesome games along the way. You see, in May of 1982, George Lucas formed Lucasfilm Games. That existed as a game developer alongside Lucasfilm. However, the rights to the Star Wars IP for video games was not acquired back until 1993. So there was a time where they didn't actually own the IP themselves. And immediately upon gaining the IP back, they released the iconic Star Wars X-Wing. And over the next 20 years, titles like Jedi Starfighter, Knights of the Old Republic, Star Wars Battlefront, The Force Unleashed, Shadows of the Empire, and Bounty Hunter were released. And that's just to name a few. When Lucasfilm was purchased by Disney in October of 2012, it only took about 6 months for Disney to completely shut down Lucasfilm Games and really only keep it around in name only. So what would have been different if Lucasfilm Games had remained under the LucasArts umbrella? Well, we might not have seen games like Fallen Order or Jedi Survivor, as well as the Battlefront reboots. I do think the sheer volume of what was created previously shows that we would have seen many, many more games than what we have seen in these past 10 to 11 years. Now, more isn't always better. Just because we would have gotten more games doesn't mean it would always be the best quality, and we've seen that with TV shows. As they crank out more and more, the shows kind of go down in quality. But at the very least, we might have still seen games that were canceled that fans were excited about, like Star Wars 1313, like Attack Squadrons, and like Battle of the Sith overlords. These were games that were intriguing to the fans that weren't made, and we might have seen other games come about as that Lucasfilm games would have been kept intact, particularly maybe things branching off of the Underworld TV show and the sequel trilogy done by George Lucas. Those are things that may have been just absolutely awesome for the fandom to enjoy. Personally, I have grown to loathe EA, particularly for their microtransactions in many of their sporting titles, and so I am so glad now to know that EA no longer has the license to the Star Wars IP, and even though Disney still holds all that, the playing cards, so to speak, it doesn't land with EA any longer, and I think that is a good thing. So there might even still be hope for video games in our universe, if not in this alternate George still owning Star Wars universe. Well, and that brings us today to our final topic, and maybe the most important one, or even the most disagreed upon topic, and that is, what would the state of the fandom be? But before we do that, let's check in with C3PO.
Sometimes I just don't understand human behavior.
Yeah, that's our 3PO Cam. He's hanging out in the back enjoying, and I hope you are enjoying this too. If you haven't already, please give the video a like as we hop into this last topic. So, the fandom. Would this have actually been positive for the fans? Because I think a big part of the division of Star Wars, while I think we can blame Disney for a lot, I think social media has done a lot to divide the fan base. And so I find it somewhat ironic that I'm posting a video on social media that you're consuming on social media, that hopefully you're commenting down below and we're interacting on all of this. But honestly, because anyone can do what I'm doing, which is turn on a camera or open up a computer and give their thoughts, it's created a lot of division, maybe even more so. And that isn't necessarily Disney's fault. So would this be any different in the George Lucas owned Star Wars universe? When we opened up the video, I said that Disney has done more than anything else to divide the fandom, but that doesn't mean it was all sunshine and roses and strolls along the beach where everyone got along hand in hand and everyone agreed. No, whenever you take something that people are passionate about and have opinions about, you're going to find differing opinions that people hold to passionately. And we don't want to push aside, but there was a lot of division among the fandom in regards to the prequel trilogy. Some have even speculated that the hate George got around the sequel trilogy, and you saw with the cast and the writing and some of the jokes and memes that have been made about a lot of those things, that it caused George to want to sell in the first place. I don't believe that's to be the case. I really think George just was tired and didn't think he had it in him to keep going. And so to keep Star Wars intact, it was best to give it to someone who wouldn't just disappear. And so he decided to sell to Disney, because Disney's been around forever and seemingly will continue to be around, though they've been having some massive struggles as of late. However, George just keeping Star Wars and making his trilogy may not have done very much to bring the fans back together. I'm sure there's many that would still be very divided over how George would decide to go ahead with certain things like midichlorians and the wills and some of those other aspects of the prequel trilogy that people did not like. But in this fictional world that I've created for us to think about, I do think it would be better than the current state we have today. I do not think there would be as much distrust of what was being made. And at the end of the day, even if we disagreed with George, we understood that George was writing what he believed to be the best story for Star Wars. It wasn't about all these other things. Now, for sure, there were some offshoots and cash grabs and toys and merch and all those things, looking at you, Ewoks, that were created to try and sell certain things. But I think when we look at Disney as a machine and what they do to IPs, look what they're doing to Marvel, look what they're doing to Star Wars, I can't help but think that the fan base would at least be more behind George. But again, we'd have nothing to compare it to. So maybe Star Wars fans are just always going to be upset and always going to be angry. I don't know. I hope that's not the case, particularly around the Ahsoka series coming out soon. I hope that that's something that can actually bring us together because it's Dave Filoni. I don't know, Dave, where you were for season 3 of Mandalorian. I want to talk about that. But with all that aside, I do believe that George owning Star Wars would have made for better fandom, a better interaction. And honestly, as time has gone on, even if you take the sequel trilogy out of it, I've grown to love the prequels more and more. The prequels are some of my kids' favorite movies. They don't even really love the original trilogy. They love the prequel trilogy, particularly because they love Padme and they love Leia and the babies that they get to see born at the end. That's their favorite. They love Revenge of the Sith, and I'm proud that they do. We haven't really watched much of the sequel trilogy, if I'm being honest, because I don't enjoy it as much. So I'm not going to watch that as much. But that's just my opinion. That's what I think would be different if George never sold to Disney. What do you think? What did I miss? What else would have happened, or what else would have been better or worse that I didn't catch? I'm sure you're already typing it down in the comments below, and I hope you are. I'd love to hear from you down there. Thanks for watching. If you haven't already, please consider giving the video a like. I appreciate you watching all the way through to the end. If you like content like this, please consider subscribing. And if you want to see more as the Ahsoka series comes out, I'm going to be doing a ton of live streams and all kinds of other content around that release. So I hope to see you in the comments. Remember, the Force will be with you always.